Alright guys, this is it. We're back for another episode of Meta Saturdays. So, the biggest thing that's been happening this week is that, there's been a hot debate about whether Azir Irelia is a really powerful deck or whether it's, maybe just kind of like people aren't really countering it yet, or, people haven't learned how to play against it yet. And at this point in time, I can confidently say, yeah, no, it's just pretty nuts. The highest win rate version of Irelia Azir, which also happens to be my version, is coming out at 58% win rate for a week 1 deck, which is, pretty absurd. So real quick though, before we get into it, for those of you guys who don't know the drill, which I don't blame you because I haven't really done these videos weekly in a while, basically, this is my weekly meta report where I will take every single one of my decks on my website and update it, tweak the cards to be able to give you guys the highest win rate decks in the game. Now, I've decided that I'm going to be doing this on Saturdays, which means if you, see every single week at the start of Saturday, you will be able to refresh this page and get updated versions of all of these decks. You gotta update your versions, guys, because I spend so much time looking through the stats, and I see a lot of people playing older versions of my lists that are made for, different metas that aren't doing as well now, and I spend a lot of time updating these decks so you guys can have the best ones possible. Just make sure you update your lists. Deck building is really important. A lot of things are kind of dependent on specific metas that change over time, and you'd be surprised how much of a difference 3 or 4 cards out of 40 will make. Now, this week we have something very special, which is I have added little guides. Let's go ahead and check out, look. Let's do dragons. You can see on the Mobalytics page here, I've written out a little kind of like intro for the guide, a little bit of a mulligan guide, and even kind of specific tips, usually for kind of how to play the deck or the matchup. Consider this more of an overview than anything else, mostly for people that aren't really familiar with the plans of the deck or how it works, but I thought this might be really helpful to you guys. Also, it shows which matchups the deck is strong against and which matchups the deck is weak against. So check out these guides. I'm hoping that it will help you guys pick up the deck, especially the mulligans, which I've seen a lot of people really ask about, like, how do you mulligan this deck? Well, this should help. Lastly, I regret to inform you guys that this new deck guide update is going to be taking the place this week of what would normally be the new decks this week slot. The reason being I'm working on some back-end changes for the site that should in theory be done by next week, that will be able to incorporate the new decks. You guys will see exactly what I mean. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's talk about Irelia and her win rate. It's not really the week 1 win rate in this case. Obviously, week 1 win rate is going to be subject to a lot of statistical noise. There's a lot of different reasons why that could be happening. The bigger thing that's a bit of a warning sign with Irelia Azir is the impact that it's having on the overall metagame. For the most part, the biggest trends we're seeing as this week progresses is we're seeing a lot of slower decks basically getting completely obliterated in terms of win rates. And those slower strategies happen to include both Malphite and Zilean, whose win rates are suffering, well, at the very least in part due to that. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, we've been playing a little bit of a game on my Twitch stream, which is every day we'll check Malphite and Zilean's win rate stats. And fun fact, they're actually almost identical, which is to say, really not good. And we've been trading it as a bit of a race. One day Zilean will be up 0.1%, one day, Malphite will be up. And at the start, Malphite was ahead. Zilean pretty quickly overtook him, and I'm pretty pleased to inform you guys that just a couple of days ago, we have Malphite finally bringing back the lead at 0.1% over Zilean. Zilean is at 38.8% win rate, and Malphite is at 38.9%. Now, I'm proud of you guys for this, because, I always like a good underdog story. I've been rooting for Malphite, and I've been asking you guys to put 1 copy of Malphite in every single Targon deck. I saw one person, I think like 4 days ago, I queued into one person playing a single Malphite in a Dragons deck. All right, so you guys are doing your part. We're all working together to get Malphite's win rate up, but I fear the Zilean players might start to retaliate. They're going to notice that their champion is dwindling in win rate, and they're going to start sliding in one of Zilean into Azir Irelia, alright? So we cannot rest yet, brothers. We cannot. Malphite still needs to win this race. Jokes aside, how is this affecting the metagame? Well, as mentioned, Irelia is speeding up the meta by a crazy amount. If your deck is unable to really put any sort of pressure down, you will lose to it. And what that means is decks like Watcher combo, decks like Deep even, decks like even Ezreal Draven ends up being a little too slow for it. I thought Ezreal Draven would be at least able to kind of go even against the deck, but usually just ends up getting countered because they have enough ways of being able to protect their Azir usually. So how do you counter Irelia Azir? Well, what a perfect opportunity to check out this new feature on this site where you can go to the deck and, oh look, there's a little guide here, and it says that Azir Irelia is weak against Thresh, Nasus, and Aggro. Well, that makes sense because those are decks that can apply enough early pressure to be able to race down Irelia Azir in a lot of cases. So what that's going to mean is, you know, the slower decks suffer, but if you can kill them quickly, you're at least going to be a little bit favored. And it's no coincidence that Thresh Nasus and my new Shurima Swarm deck are the only other decks to have tier 1 win rates right now because they can stand their own against Irelia Azir. Now, you might say to that, Swim, well, by that definition, it sounds like Irelia Azir is kind of a tier 0 deck. Yup. Yeah, Irelia Azir is absolutely, I mean, it's pretty much the strongest deck in the game right now. A lot of people were under the impression early on that, you know, its win rate would drop off as it started getting countered, and people figured out how to play around it. But for the most part, its win rate is only going up at high levels of play because it's a very skill testing deck that you are going to have to play differently every time. And as people refine the list and learn how to play it tighter, it will get better. Now, this is my current meta-tuned version of Irelia Azir, and for the most part, I think this is mostly what people are running at this point. A lot of people have dropped some of the more experimental concepts, and it's important to understand, you know, why some of these cards are being ran. Green Glade Duo and Homecoming are pretty important 3-ofs just because they end up playing around some of the matchups that this deck doesn't really have great options of beating otherwise. The biggest one being Thresh Nasus for Duo, and actually maybe Homecoming as well. Thresh Nasus is one of the, you know, weak matchups for Irelia Azir, of course. And one of the most important things of deck building is making sure you're helping out your weak matchups. So Green Glade Duo, even though it's actually sort of surprisingly cumbersome in a lot of matchups, because it provides an alternate win condition against Thresh Nasus, who has no elusive blockers, no way of dealing with this except for Vile Feast, which if you Shapestone, you just win the game on the spot. You're good. And Homecoming is a catch-all against a lot of stuff when games are slowing down a little bit, and it happens to be really good against Nasus as well. And you know, speaking of Thresh Nasus, oh look, here we are. So this, if you are, you know, sick and tired of dirty Irelia Azir players, Thresh Nasus is definitely your go-to answer. Now, might not be what you want to hear, but this is by far the best and most reliable counter to Irelia Azir if, you know, we're talking about high level play. And then of course, likewise with a tier 1 win rate coming in at 56%, my version of Shurima Noxus Aggro. Now, I did end up adding the one of Darius to this version that you guys might have seen me talk about a little bit before, and the biggest reason for that is because there's actually just not a lot of Shadow Owl's failure control in this metagame. For the first time in a very, very long time, there's not really a major dominant Shadow Owl's Freljord control deck, mostly just because Azir Irelia is just kind of like stopping slow decks from existing. And then finally, the Rising decks this week are actually pretty interesting. These are decks that are specifically tuned to deal well against this kind of like, you know, early kill combo that Azir Irelia does, which are, you know, aggressive decks in turn. Overwhelm is a deck that hasn't really seen changes. You might notice this version as actually, I think, literally card for card. I changed a card and then I changed it back. Yeah, no, the deck actually hadn't, you know, overall seen any changes, but it's still a very powerful deck with a rising win rate in this metagame. And I think a bit of a potential option. I've actually recently modified a little bit my spiders list. Spiders is one of my favorite archetypes in the game, and I've played it a lot. I have a lot of experience with spiders, and I actually think it might end up being a little bit low key right now. It's not going to do great into Thresh and Nasus, but it is one of the better matchups into Azir Irelia, especially because you're combining early Swarm with the Fearsome keyword. And Azir Irelia doesn't really have good Fearsome blockers, so usually you can really punish that aspect of the deck. This is my current version of spiders, and as you might have noticed, I've gone back to the 2 Fading Memories, which is something that I was running 1 Fading Memories a while ago, that I know a lot of you guys were using as well. And Fading Memories ends up being really good for pushing this sort of fearsome game plan when you're using it on Stygian Onlooker for fearsome, or, of course, Skitterer, which is kind of the entire point of this deck. So Fading Memories ends up being pretty essential for our game plan here. And if nothing else, you can always use it in the late game for another Doom Beast, right? And of course, there's a lot more different kinds of aggro decks you can play, but because Shurima Swarm and Spiders tend to be the fastest forms of aggro, they end up being the best for being able to race down Irelia Azir. The problem with Nightfall aggro, Pirate Burn, and even Discard aggro is that they're just a little bit slower on average. I mean, Discard aggro has some really fast starts, but it does like to slow down, you know, in the mid game in a lot of hands, and you can't really do that against Irelia Azir. Shurima Overwhelm comes into the meta mostly because of its ability to counter Thresh and Nasus, of course, because they have very low HP chump blockers. This deck trounces on Thresh and Nasus, and it actually does all right against Azir Irelia as well. A bit of a pro tip in a matchup like that with Overwhelm. I don't think a lot of people are really doing this, but you should often be thinking about keeping Battle Fury in your opening hand in that matchup. In fact, it actually, oh look, it mentions that right here in the little guide. Oh, look at that. If you're facing a deck that can't deal with Battle Fury, it might be worth keeping alongside a Raider. I think a lot of people look at this card as like an 8-mana card. I can't keep this in my opening hand. But against a lot of just kind of proactive race decks, you can just literally open attack on turn 5 or 6 with a Battle Fury, slapping it on like a Ruin Runner if you're open attacking on turn 6, or a Ruthless Raider on turn 5, and sometimes just close a game out like that. And of course, you know, you're beating Homecoming by using it on the spell shields. It's a good way to just win that race if you have a made hand. But that's pretty much this meta in a nutshell. Those are kind of like the significant changes and how decks have been adapting to counter other decks. For the most part, a lot of the other decks haven't really seen any sorts of changes or any sorts of, you know, nothing modified off the stats, although I'll be keeping an eye out and making my own changes as well. So that's going to be it for me for this week. Again, no new decks this week. Next week, there should be a new deck section on the site. We will see. And yeah, let me know if you guys have any feedback, honestly, on the way that the kind of like little tips and sort of descriptions are set up on these decks, because I was thinking, you know, about adding more stuff to these, but I didn't want it to go on too long, or like different kinds of things I could add as well, like, you know, maybe specific matchup guides or something. Let me know. All right, I'll see you guys next week.